If I can go ahead and call the meeting to order, Budget and Fiscal Affairs Oversight Committee. We have two bills on the agenda this afternoon. We will hear one of them, and I'll ask Vice Chairman of the committee, Mike Chokas, to chair that portion when we get there, as I am the presenter of that particular measure. House Bill 669 is going to be held over from today's meeting. We are going to meet tomorrow at a time and room to be determined at the request of the author. He is working in good faith with a number of parties to try to get to the final language on House Bill 669. So I appreciate the members of the committee. I know they're very busy. I know you all are very busy at this time, but if you would work with us and look on your desk in the morning for a notice, I believe we can do it in a short period of time tomorrow, probably 30 minutes. To give a fair and open hearing to Representative Clark on his measure, House Bill 669. At this point, I want to turn the meeting over to the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mike Chokas, and ask him to consider House Bill 920.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, Mr. Chairman, I'd like you to bring before us House Bill 920.
Chairman Chokas, if it pleases the committee, as you will recall, last week we met and had a presentation related to House Bill 920, and by the way, I bring it to you by substitute today. LC 3433-94S is the document from which I'll be working. The idea of that presentation was to have Dr. Wheeler and the folks that present this information basically compile it and work to prepare the tax expenditure reports, provide us information as to how they would see the additional information we're requesting fit in. As such, they have proposed some language. Does everybody have the substitute? Okay, I'll pause there. As such, we essentially have replaced the original inserted language that previously fell between lines 16 and 21. We redacted that language in its entirety and added the suggested language. Since it's brief and for the committee and the audience information, since we don't have, I don't think we've handed out copies, I'd like to read the new language. On line 16, it begins, the tax expenditure review may also include a regularly produced annex to include analysis of specific tax expenditures. Such analysis would include, when possible, a description of the objective of the tax expenditure taken from the original legislation, information relevant to determining whether the expenditure is meeting its stated purpose, an analysis of the tax expenditure's an analysis of the tax expenditure's effect on the administration of the tax system, and an analysis of the persons, corporations, or other entities that are directly benefited by the expenditure. Mr. Chairman, what we simply seek to do is encourage additional information to be placed in the tax expenditure report so that this body, the Georgia legislature, as well as other interested parties, can review and develop a policy statement around each expenditure as applicable to best look for the dollars that Georgia is expending through what we are referring to as a tax expenditure. This would be otherwise known as a credit or an exemption from a Georgia tax. I'd answer any questions and ask the committee to favorably consider moving House Bill 920 forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, we're entertaining questions on House Bill 920. Members of the committee? Yes, you go.
Just a quick question, Mr. Chairman. What is the purpose of this bill? I mean, what's the reason why?
If I may,
sure.
We share in mind, we're like a duet here, Chairman Chokas. What we're after is, if you recall from our presentation last week, the tax expenditure report, for a particular credit or exemption, it lists an amount. That legislation passed, I believe, 2 years ago, and those reports have been created for our review. What we seek to do within this annex, as it's being called, is to provide additional information to give that data context. Whereas in that report now, you may see, you'll see a code section, OCCGA code section. It'll list what the expenditure was, a credit or an exemption, and then you'll see the trailing 3 years thus far of how much that cost the state in revenue. What we're seeking to do in this report is add those things that are articulated here, what the legislature's intent was when they granted this credit or exemption, then follow through to see if that legislative intent is actually coming to pass. In other words, if we had granted an exemption, well, one that's being talked about this year, I would use an example as an anecdotal example if I can, to take the sales tax off energy used in manufacturing. The legislative intent is to create additional manufacturing jobs in Georgia, to keep manufacturers open that would otherwise maybe be shuttered if we were not competitive, and to also have expansions done. Okay, if we pass that this year and that costs the state a sum of money on an annual basis, we would want to note in this report that the reason we did that was to increase jobs in Georgia. Then over the time period that goes into place, we would look at, how many manufacturers located in Georgia, did some expand in Georgia, did we still lose some in Georgia, and I would submit that if no real change happened, perhaps the legislature would look at in a years out that manufacturing, that exemption would go away, and another one would be tried to stimulate the economy. So what we seek to do here is to provide context to the data so that we can have a measurable result and find out if the outcome that we wish to promote in the state is in fact being achieved.
Thank you. Any further questions? Bruce?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. As the author of this bill, I want to applaud your work, and I think it's very important work on the taxpayers' behalf. Are you perfectly happy with the language now as your amended language?
Well, I'm sure, and I'm going to say this tongue-in-cheek, Representative, I'm sure our learned colleagues in the Senate will be able to add something to it. No, on a serious matter, I think this makes sense. I mean, I think the previous language also was good, but I think hearing again in context what Dr. Wheeler had to say, how this information comes about, how we realized in her presentation that some of these exemptions are 30 years old. We tweaked the language to say if the legislative statement can be found, we want to include it. We certainly don't want somebody in Dr. Wheeler's office or their staff spending hours upon hours to track down something because they feel like the report can't be put in at all unless all legislative intent can be found. So I think what you see in the difference between the sub and the original language is we give them the may be included, so you can have any or the additional data we require. So we're just trying to make the report better, and as time goes on, the data will be filled in around the expenditures.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, because in your explanation of that, it sort of clarifies the when possible, and that's when it's just such a legacy of this particular program, whatever going on, it might not be possible to find the original legislative intent, and that's why those two words are used, when possible.
Right, and to be clear, my intent, and I think that of this committee, and should this pass the state legislature, theirs, it would not be like when possible, like when it's in our best interest included. It would be when it's available to include it. I would hope if all the information was, because we may have had passed it credits or exemptions that have been very effective. We may have passed others that have not been as effective, and I personally can take the bad news with the good if we need to take corrective action, and I believe that's what we're looking for.
Well, and would you be amenable to the idea of instead of saying when possible to when available? On line 18.
I don't see a problem with that. In doing the analysis, Representative, here's my caveat in that, and I'd ask the learned attorney if I could. I know the last "and" is an analysis of the persons, corporations, and entities that are directly benefit. I know that there's some question in some cases whether this information, may be obtained through tax records. That is, in fact, that is not public information. If the attorney can tell me that we say when available rather than when possible would not adversely affect a privacy situation and perhaps be in conflict with other law, I'm absolutely fine with the when available as opposed to possible, because I think that makes our intent clear. If Chair, can we ask the attorney?
I think you make a good point, Mr. Chairman. When available is a much broader scope. I mean, whether it's easily available or we often use the phrase readily available is one thing. When available widens the scope into some areas that, although it is available, it's not easily accessible or, as I'd say, readily available.
Well, then
I think that widens the scope of what we're burdening or asking.
Well, thank you for that clarity, because I can envision where that would end up costing the taxpayer too much money. So, all right. Now, thank you for the clarification on that.
No, I thank the representative for the question, and to be clear that this, I think, is being recorded, and that makes a good point. I believe what I hear you say is we want it, when possible and when practical, and perhaps we can, in all seriousness, work with our colleagues in the Senate to further refine the legislative intent, because it is not my intent when I say when possible, taking this accepted language, that we cherry pick when we want to put the information in the report. I want all the information in the report that tells the true story, as long as it doesn't cost more to obtain that information than one would reasonably see the savings to come about for the taxpayer.
Perfect. Thank you. Are there any other questions from the members of the committee?
If you have none, Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate time.
I think that now is the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask the committee to vote on the substitute to House Bill 920, LC 343394S, with a do-pass recommendation.
Got a motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Committee, any further discussion? No further discussion. All those in favor of LC 343394S receiving the do-pass recommendation signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Congratulations.
Thank you, Chairman Chuggis. We don't have any information. That concludes our business today. Again, HB 669 will be held over for tomorrow. Ask the committee members to look on their desk for the posting of that meeting. Anyone with interest in that legislation will have that posted outside of Capitol 417. We're trying to give the author ample time to work out the details with various state agencies as well as the governor's office and interested parties. No further business before the committee. Will stand adjourned without objection. No further business. We are adjourned.
Quick question.
Yes.